The red warning lights on every galactic map told the same story about Sector 9 Delta. Stay away. Don't go there. Death awaits. For over 200 years, this message had been clear to every species in the galaxy. The sector was marked with the deepest crimson color possible, the universal sign for absolute danger. 17 different alien species had tried to explore this mysterious region of space. Some were brave explorers looking for new worlds. Others were scientists curious about the strange energy readings coming from the area. A few were military expeditions sent by governments wanting to claim new territory. All of them had one thing in common. They never came back home. Commander Vextar sat in his command chair aboard the Altian battleship, staring at the sensor data with both his main eyes and his smaller secondary eyes. The Altarians were one of the most advanced species in the galaxy, masters of space technology and energy manipulation. But even they couldn't make sense of what they were seeing from Sector 9 Delta. "Sir, these readings don't make any sense," his tactical officer said, his voice shaking slightly. "The gravitational forces in that sector are moving in patterns that should be impossible. They're like hurricanes made of pure gravity, spinning and twisting space itself." Vextar nodded grimly. "And those plasma storms are even worse. The energy levels are off our charts. Any ship that gets caught in one of those storms would be torn apart instantly. The heat alone would melt our strongest hull materials." The commander had spent his entire career studying dangerous regions of space. He had seen black holes that could swallow entire solar systems. He had witnessed supernovas that could blind sensors from light years away. But Sector 9 Delta was different. It wasn't just dangerous. It seemed to actively fight against anything that tried to enter it. The energy fluctuations are so intense they would break apart the basic building blocks of matter. Vextar continued, reading from his instruments. "Whatever force exists in that sector is completely beyond our understanding. It's like the laws of physics themselves are broken there." But while the Altian commander worried about these impossible forces, something amazing was happening deep inside the forbidden sector. Far from the patrol ships and warning buoys that marked the sector's edges, life was thriving in ways that would shock the entire galaxy. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the wide observation deck of the orbital platform called Haven's Rest. Through the transparent walls, he could see one of the most beautiful sights in the universe. A massive plasma storm was dancing across the sky, its brilliant colors painting the darkness with sheets of blue, green, and gold light. The storm moved like a living thing, twisting and flowing in patterns that seemed almost musical. For most alien species, this storm would mean instant death. The plasma was hot enough to vaporize metal, and the energy fields would fry any electronic system. But for the humans living in Sector 9 Delta, it was just another night's entertainment. The station's bioadaptive shields absorbed the storm's energy and converted it into power for their homes and cities. Jake had grown up watching these storms. As a child, he would press his face against the windows and watch in wonder as the colors danced across the sky. His parents had told him stories about how dangerous these storms were supposed to be, but to Jake, they were just part of home. Lieutenant Amy Walsh called out from her position at the communication station. "Captain, we just lost contact with another council probe at the outer markers. That's the 4th one this year." Jake wasn't surprised. The Galactic Council kept sending automated probes to try to figure out what was happening in their sector. The probes would get to the edge of the dangerous region, take some readings, and then suddenly go silent. The Council assumed they were being destroyed by the hostile environment. The truth was very different. The humans had been carefully retrieving these probes and studying them. Each probe gave them valuable information about the outside galaxy and the species that lived there. Jake's people had been isolated in Sector 9 Delta for 3 generations, and these probes were their only window into the wider universe. Jake thought about his grandmother, Elena Morrison, who had been part of the first human colony ship to enter Sector 9 Delta. Back then, it had been called the Impossible Sector by everyone who knew about it. The early human settlers had lost many people learning how to survive in this hostile environment. But humans had something that other species seemed to lack. They refused to give up. Where other species saw death and destruction, humans saw challenge and opportunity. The gravitational storms that crushed alien ships became sources of energy for human cities. The plasma hurricanes that melted other species' technology became the foundation for new kinds of bioadaptive materials. The impossible physics of the sector became the key to humanity's greatest technological advances. Now, 30,000 humans lived in 17 different colonies spread throughout Sector 9 Delta. They had cities that floated in gravity wells, space stations that fed off plasma storms, and ships that could dance through forces that would destroy any other vessel in the galaxy. What the rest of the universe considered a death trap, humans had turned into the most advanced civilization in their region of space. The Council Patrol vessel Stellar Pride had been having a routine day until everything went wrong at once. Captain Zixare had been reviewing standard navigation reports when her ship's proximity alarm started screaming. Her navigation officer, a tall blue-skinned Calarian, looked up from his console with panic in his large black eyes. "Captain, our navigation system just failed completely. We're being pulled into Sector 9 Delta's gravity well." Zixare felt her blood turn cold. Every spacefaring species knew about Sector 9 Delta. It was the place where ships went to die. The gravitational forces that were so twisted and unpredictable that they could crush a vessel in seconds or stretch it apart like pulled candy. Her crew represented 5 different species, all experienced space travelers, and every one of them knew what this meant. "Emergency power to engines," she ordered, trying to keep her voice steady. "All hands to emergency stations." But it was no use. The ship's engines, designed by some of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, simply couldn't fight against the impossible forces pulling them deeper into the forbidden sector. The Stellar Pride groaned and shuddered as gravitational waves washed over it like ocean tides. Warning lights flashed red across every console as systems began failing one by one. The ship's engineer, a mechanical species called the Vorthan, worked frantically at his station. "Captain, the gravity fields are fluctuating in patterns our computers can't predict. Our engines weren't designed for this kind of stress." Zixare watched helplessly as the ship drifted deeper into the sector that had claimed so many lives. Her crew was scared but professional, running through emergency procedures that everyone knew were probably useless. This was how it ended for ships that entered Sector 9 Delta. They got pulled in by forces beyond their understanding, and then they simply vanished forever. The captain was about to order her crew to prepare for the worst when something impossible happened. Her sensor officer, a young Tellurian with excellent eyesight, suddenly straightened up at his station. "Captain, I'm reading something on sensors. Ships are approaching our position." Zixare stared at him in disbelief. "That's impossible. Nothing can move in these gravitational fields." But as she looked at her own command display, she could see the sensor contacts moving toward them. 3 ships were approaching through the deadly environment, and they weren't just surviving. They were moving with grace and purpose through forces that should have destroyed them instantly. What shocked her even more was how these mystery ships moved. They didn't fight against the gravitational waves like normal vessels would. Instead, they seemed to dance with them, their hulls bending and flexing like they were alive. The ships looked like they were made of some kind of organic material that could change shape as needed. Then her communications officer picked up an incoming transmission. The voice that came through was calm and friendly, speaking in perfect galactic standard language. "Council vessel, this is Captain Mike Davis of the Human Colonial Fleet. We picked up your distress signal. We're here to help." The bridge of the Stellar Pride fell completely silent. Zixare stared at her communications console like it had just spoken in an ancient dead language. Human? She had heard of humans, of course. They were supposed to be a relatively new species that had just started exploring space in the last few centuries. They were considered primitive by galactic standards, still using basic chemical rockets and simple energy weapons. But humans living in Sector 9 Delta? That was impossible. The sector would kill any known life form within minutes. Finally, Zixare found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Human? You're actually human? How are you alive in this sector?" The response came back with what sounded like laughter in the human's voice. "Born here, actually, Captain. My family's been living in 9 Delta for 3 generations now. But let's get you folks to safety first, and then we can talk about the details." What followed was the most amazing rescue operation Zixare had ever witnessed. The human ships moved through the deadly gravitational fields like fish swimming through water. They attached flexible cables to the Stellar Pride and began towing it toward what they called a safe zone. During the journey, Zixare got her first look at human technology up close. Their ships were unlike anything she had ever seen. The hull seemed to be alive, constantly shifting and adapting to the changing gravitational forces. When a particularly strong gravity wave hit, the ships would stretch and bend instead of breaking. It was like watching a master dancer perform a routine that everyone else thought was impossible. Captain Davis explained that their rescue ship, the Pathfinder, was built using what humans call bioadaptive technology. The ship could literally grow new parts when needed and heal itself if damaged. The hull was made from a living metal that could sense gravitational changes and adjust its structure in real time. Over the next week, as the human rescue fleet escorted the Stellar Pride to safety, Zixere and her crew got to see things that changed their understanding of what was possible in the universe. They saw human cities floating in gravity wells that should have crushed them flat. They watched human children playing in spacesuits outside stations that were being bombarded by energy that would kill most adults from other species. The humans had taken the galaxy's most dangerous region and turned it into a thriving civilization. They had cities with populations in the tens of thousands, space stations that harvested energy from plasma storms, and technology that seemed to break the basic laws of physics. When the Stellar Pride finally limped back to Council space, it carried with it video footage and sensor data that would shock the entire galactic community. The evidence showed massive human settlements thriving in conditions that every species in the galaxy considered instantly lethal. The footage spread quickly through council networks, and soon every major government and scientific organization was demanding answers. How had a supposedly primitive species accomplished what the galaxy's greatest civilizations had deemed impossible? The discovery would force every species in the galaxy to completely reconsider what they thought they knew about humans and what was possible in the universe. The council delegation had never seen anything like the conference room they now sat in aboard New Eden colony. The walls seemed to pulse gently with a soft, living light, and the surface felt warm to the touch like skin. Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, the chief scientist of the colony, noticed their confused expressions and smiled. "I know it looks strange to you," she said, placing her hand flat against the wall. "We call this bioadaptive engineering. This entire room wasn't built in the traditional sense. It was grown." The alien delegates exchanged worried glances. The Calarian representative, his blue skin turning a darker shade that indicated stress, leaned forward in his chair. "Grown? You mean this structure's alive?" Dr. Rodriguez nodded enthusiastically. "In a way, yes. The walls are made from a living metal that can think and adapt. When the gravitational forces outside change, the walls automatically adjust their thickness and flexibility to compensate. When we need more space, the room literally grows larger. When a plasma storm hits, the walls absorb the energy and convert it into power for our life support systems." She walked over to what looked like a normal window, but as she approached, the transparent surface began to shift and change. It became thicker and darker as a gravitational wave passed by the station, protecting everyone inside from forces that would have crushed a normal building flat. "Our ancestors who first came to this sector had to learn everything from scratch," Dr. Rodriguez continued. "Traditional construction materials just couldn't survive here. Metal became brittle and snapped. Concrete crumbled under the gravitational stress. So we had to think differently." Admiral Tom Bradley stood at the back of the room, watching as the council representatives tried to understand what they were seeing. He was a big man with gray hair and kind eyes, but his calm presence commanded respect from everyone around him. As a commander of Sector 9 Delta's defense fleet, he had seen many impossible things become routine. Through the adaptive window, the delegates could see something that made their jaws drop. Human children were playing outside the station in what could only be described as a gravitational playground. They wore special suits and were laughing as they floated and spun in gravity fields that would instantly crush the bones of any other species. The children were playing a game that looked like three-dimensional tag, using the shifting gravity wells to launch themselves in directions that seemed to defy physics. One child would push off from a gravity anchor and sail through a zone where the gravitational force was pulling in 3 different directions at once. Another child would catch them and use the momentum to spin around a gravity well like it was a playground swing. "How is this possible?" whispered the council's chief scientist, an elderly Altian whose secondary eyes were working overtime trying to process what he was seeing. "Those gravitational forces should be tearing those children apart." Admiral Bradley stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. "When my grandfather first came to this sector 60 years ago, we lost a lot of good people learning how to survive here. The early settlers didn't understand the gravitational patterns. They built their first habitats using traditional methods and watched them get crushed or torn apart within days. He paused, looking out at the playing children with pride in his eyes. But humans have one trait that seems to be rare in the galaxy. We don't give up. When something seems impossible, we don't walk away. We figure out how to make it possible. The Admiral gestured toward a massive structure visible in the distance. It looked like a city-sized flower made of metal and light, its petals constantly opening and closing as it rode the gravitational currents like a surfer riding ocean waves. That's our main residential complex, he explained. It houses about 15,000 people. The entire structure moves and breathes with the gravity fields. Instead of fighting against the forces that exist here, we learn to work with them. Dr. Rodriguez brought up a holographic display showing the colony's power systems. The image showed energy flowing through the station like blood through veins, but instead of coming from traditional power plants, the energy was being harvested directly from the chaotic forces outside. Our power comes from the plasma storms and gravitational waves that other species find so terrifying, she explained. A single moderate storm can provide enough energy to run our entire colony for months. What you see as destruction, we see as free power. The human ships docked at the station were equally impressive. Unlike the rigid metal vessels used by other species, human ships looked organic and alive. Their hulls rippled and flowed like liquid metal, constantly adjusting their shape to match the changing conditions around them. Our ships don't break because they are designed to bend, Admiral Bradley explained as they watched one vessel navigate through a gravitational maze that would have torn apart any conventional spacecraft. The hull material can stretch to 10 times its original length without losing structural integrity. When a gravity wave hits, the ship rides it like a boat riding an ocean swell. The technology went far beyond just buildings and ships. The humans had developed tools that adapted to their environment in real time. Their computers could think and learn, adjusting their processing methods to work better in the high-energy environment. Their medical equipment could grow new parts when needed and evolve to treat conditions that no other species had ever encountered. What impressed the council delegates most was how natural it all seemed to the humans. Children grew up learning to read gravitational patterns the way other species learned to read weather. Adults worked with living tools that responded to their thoughts and emotions. Elderly humans moved through impossible environments with the grace of people who had spent their entire lives dancing with forces that could destroy planets. The council's chief scientist finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. You've accomplished the truly impossible. You've made a home in conditions that should have killed you all. Dr. Rodriguez looked at him with a patient smile of someone who had heard this reaction many times before. No, honored delegate, we haven't accomplished the impossible. We've simply redefined what impossible means. Where you see chaos and destruction, we see opportunity and potential. Where you see forces that kill, we see forces that can give life in new and amazing ways. She gestured toward the children still playing in the gravitational fields outside. Those kids don't see impossible physics. They just see their playground. And that perhaps the most human thing of all, turning the universe's greatest challenges into our children's games. The news about humans living in Sector 9 Delta spread through the galaxy like wildfire. Within hours of the Stellar Pride's return, emergency communication networks were buzzing with reports that seemed too incredible to believe. The impossible had happened. Not only were humans alive in the galaxy's most dangerous region, but they were thriving there. On the Altrian homeworld, scientists work around the clock trying to understand the sensor data and video footage. The evidence was undeniable, but it challenged everything they thought they knew about physics and biology. How could any species survive in conditions that would instantly kill the most advanced civilizations? The Calarian government called emergency meetings with their top military advisors. If humans could live in places that killed everyone else, what did that mean for galactic security? Were humans hiding some kind of superweapon technology? The questions multiplied faster than anyone could find answers. Within a week, the Galactic Council had called the first emergency session in over 50 years. Representatives from hundreds of species gathered in the Great Assembly Hall on the neutral world of Nexus Prime. The debates that followed were unlike anything in the Council's history. Some species saw opportunity. The Vorthan Collective wanted to study human bioadaptive technology to improve their own engineering. The The scientific-minded Tellurians proposed joint research projects to understand how humans had solved problems that had stumped the galaxy's greatest minds for centuries. But other species were afraid. The militant Zorkan Empire argued that any species capable of surviving in impossible conditions might be too dangerous to coexist with. The cautious hegemony worried that humans might have developed weapons based on the same technology that let them survive in deadly environments. If they can live in gravitational fields that crush our ships, argued the Zorkan representative, his scaled skin turning red with agitation, what's to stop them from using those same forces as weapons against us? The debates raged for days without resolution. Some wanted to quarantine human space until they could understand the technology better. Others proposed immediate diplomatic contact to establish trade relationships. A few extreme voices even suggested preemptive military action to prevent humans from becoming a threat. It was during these heated discussions that Captain Rachel Moore arrived at Nexus Prime. She was a woman in her 40s with calm eyes and graying hair, representing the colonial settlements that most of the galaxy didn't even know existed. She had been chosen to speak for humanity because she had been born in normal space and had chosen to move to the frontier colonies as an adult. When she entered the Great Assembly Hall, conversation stopped and thousands of alien eyes turned to look at her. Many of the delegates had never seen a human before, and they studied her with intense curiosity. She looked so ordinary, so unremarkable. How could someone who seemed so normal come from a species capable of impossible feats? Captain Moore walked to the central speaking platform with confidence that impressed even her critics. When she began to speak, her voice carried clearly throughout the massive chamber. Honorable delegates of the Galactic Council, she began, I understand that recent discoveries have raised many questions about my species. I'm here to provide answers and to represent the human colonies that call the frontier regions home. She paused, looking around at the sea of alien faces watching her every move. First, let me be clear about something. We didn't set out to prove anything to anyone. We didn't colonize dangerous regions to show off or to threaten other species. We simply refused to accept that any environment was beyond human capability. The chamber murmured with translation devices working in hundreds of languages. Rachel waited for quiet before continuing. When humans first reached space, we looked at your map showing safe travel routes and forbidden zones. But we also looked at the forbidden zones and asked ourselves a simple question. What if they're not actually forbidden? What if they're just difficult? A delegate from the scientific community interrupted. But Captain, the mathematics are clear. The gravitational forces alone in these regions should make life impossible. Rachel smiled. That's what we thought too, at first. But humans have a saying, impossible just means nobody has figured out how to do it yet. What happened next shocked everyone in the chamber. Intelligence reports that had been flooding in from across the galaxy were suddenly displayed on the main screen for all to see. The report showed something that changed everything the Council thought it knew about human expansion. Humans weren't just living in Sector 9 Delta. They had been quietly colonizing every region that the galaxy considered uninhabitable. There were human settlements on the edges of black holes, using the intense gravitational fields as power sources. There were human cities built inside neutron star systems, somehow surviving radiation that would sterilize entire planets. Even more shocking, humans had established colonies in the void between galaxies, in regions so empty and cold that most species couldn't even send probes as successfully. These humans had learned to harvest energy from the cosmic background radiation and build cities in the emptiest parts of the universe. The Council Chairman, an ancient being whose species had been exploring space for millions of years, stood up slowly. His voice shook as he spoke. Captain Moore, how many of these regions that we consider dead zones do you actually occupy? Rachel consulted the data pad she carried, though she already knew the numbers by heart. Currently, we have active colonies in about 437 regions that your navigation charts mark as forbidden or uninhabitable. She looked up at the stunned faces around her, though we prefer to call them challenging rather than forbidden. The chamber fell completely silent. The implications hit everyone at the same time like a physical blow. Humanity hadn't just survived in one impossible place. They had made homes in hundreds of regions that the galaxy's greatest civilizations had written off as death traps. For centuries, the various species had been mapping safe passages through the galaxy, carefully avoiding the dangerous regions that could kill unwary travelers. While they were drawing maps around these deadly areas, humans had been moving into them and building cities. The galaxy suddenly felt much smaller and much more crowded. Regions that had been considered empty buffer zones between civilizations were actually full of thriving human colonies. The balance of power that had existed for centuries was completely changed in a single moment. Captain Moore looked around at the silent assembly and realized that the galaxy would never be the same again. 3 days after Captain Rachel Moore's shocking announcement, another human arrived at the Galactic Council chambers. Captain David Parker was different from the previous human representative. Where Rachel had been diplomatic and careful with her words, David carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent his life turning impossible situations into routine problems. David was a coordinator of humanity's deep space colonies, a job that most species didn't even know existed. He had been born on a space station orbiting a pulsar, raised in radiation levels that would kill most aliens instantly. To him, the impossible was just another word for Tuesday. As he walked to the speaking platform, David looked around at the thousands of alien delegates watching him with mixtures of fear, curiosity, and disbelief. He had requested this special session to clear up what he called some basic misunderstandings about human intentions and capabilities. "Honored delegates," David began, his voice carrying easily through the vast chamber. "I've been listening to your debates over the past few days, and I think there's something fundamental that you're missing about my species." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "You want to know our secret? You want to understand how humans can live in places that kill everyone else? The answer is actually quite simple." David gestured toward the massive display screen behind him. "We don't see dead zones. We see potential." With a simple command from his handheld device, the screen came to life showing a 3-dimensional map of the galaxy. At first, it looked like any standard navigation chart, with safe travel routes marked in green and dangerous areas marked in red. But then David activated another layer of data. Suddenly, the map exploded with tiny points of light. Hundreds upon hundreds of bright dots appeared in regions that every galactic civilization had marked as completely uninhabitable. Each dot represented a human colony, thriving in conditions that should have been instantly lethal. The chamber filled with gasps and shocked murmurs as delegates realized what they were seeing. There were human settlements clustered around black holes, using the intense gravitational forces as sources of unlimited energy. Human cities floated in the coronas of neutron stars, harvesting power from radiation that could sterilize entire planets. Even more incredible, there were colonies in the deep void between galaxies, in regions so empty and cold that most species had never even tried to explore them. These humans had learned to build civilizations in the loneliest places in the universe, creating warmth and life where physics said none should exist. "While your species spent centuries mapping safe passages through space," David continued, his voice filled with something that might have been amusement, "we were busy making homes in the places you mapped around." The true scope of human expansion was staggering. They hadn't just stumbled into a few dangerous regions by accident. They had systematically sought out every environment that other species considered impossible to survive in, and then figured out how to not just live there, but thrive there. A delegate from the scientific community stood up, her voice shaking with disbelief. "But why? Why would any species voluntarily seek out such dangerous conditions?" David smiled, and for a moment he looked like a teacher explaining something obvious to a confused student. "Because that's what humans do. Every species represented in this council has evolved to avoid danger. You've spent millions of years learning to recognize threats and stay away from them. That's smart survival strategy, and it's worked well for you." He paused, looking around the chamber at faces that represented dozens of different evolutionary paths, all of which had led to the same basic conclusion. Dangerous things should be avoided. "Humans evolved differently," David continued. "We didn't evolve to avoid danger. We evolved to overcome it. When we see something that seems impossible, our first instinct isn't to run away. Our first instinct is to figure out how to make it possible." The holographic display changed to show time-lapse images of human colonies being established. The process was like watching flowers bloom in fast motion. Humans would arrive in a region that seemed completely hostile to life, and within years they would have established thriving settlements that turned the environment's deadly forces into sources of power and prosperity. "You ask how we survive in impossible places," David said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. We don't survive them. We make them possible. The truth was both simpler and more profound than anyone had imagined. Humanity's secret wasn't some advanced technology or genetic modification. It was a fundamental difference in how they viewed the universe itself. Where other species saw barriers, humans saw challenges waiting to be overcome. The council chairman, whose species had been exploring space since before humans had invented the wheel, slowly stood up. His ancient voice carried the weight of millions of years of accumulated wisdom, but also a new uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Captain Parker, the chairman said quietly, "What happens now? How does this change the relationship between humans and the rest of the galactic community?" David's smile grew wider, and there was something in his expression that made several delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was a look of someone who had just been asked to explain their next impossible project. "Now," David said, his voice filled with anticipation. "Now we invite you to see what impossible really looks like." The display behind him changed once more, showing a region of space that most delegates had never even heard of. It was a void between galaxy clusters, a region so vast and empty that even light took millions of years to cross it. It was a place where the very concept of civilization seemed meaningless. "We've got our eye on some intergalactic void that nobody thinks can be crossed," David continued, his casual tone making the impossible sound routine. "The distance is so vast that conventional faster-than-light travel would take thousands of years. The energy requirements seem impossible. The isolation would drive most species insane." He looked around the chamber at faces that were struggling to process what they were hearing. "Care to watch us prove everyone wrong again?" The chamber remained completely silent as delegates contemplated what they had just learned. They had spent centuries thinking of humans as a new, primitive species just learning to explore space. Instead, they had discovered that humans saw the universe's most terrifying regions not as barriers to be avoided, but as new neighborhoods waiting to be settled. The galaxy would never look the same again. Every red zone on every navigation chart was now a potential human colony. Every impossible environment was just another challenge waiting for human ingenuity to turn it into home. And somewhere in the vast darkness between galaxies, human engineers were already drawing up plans for humanity's next impossible dream.